Well, thank you so much for inviting me to talk to your exhibition here. So, my name's Rob Smith. I'm a tour guide in London, and Serafina came on one of my walks a few weeks ago where I was talking about the book Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, and she invited me to talk at this exhibition. So it was quite an interesting opportunity, I thought. But then I actually got into looking at what your exhibition was about. It made me think more and more about my life as a tour guide and how I seem to live a lot of my life mingling with people who are Londoners who are long since dead and people who are no longer around. And yeah, I've talked about them so often that they feel like real people to me today. So I thought this would be an opportunity to come and talk to you about some of the people I talk about. And it just illustrates how London is this place where millions of people have lived here over lots of years, but it's also a city of ideas. It's a place where people come to put their ideas together. And the people may come and go, but the ideas kind of linger. It's like this place which almost exceeds its material space, London. It just becomes a city of ideas. So as a tour guide, this is like our raw material, what we talk about. So I just wanted to talk about to you about today. So if you just put the slide on for us. So I work with a group of friends called Footprints of London. So we were tour guides all qualified together back in 2010. And we all like really working together. So we wanted to put on tours about things which were just more than like the changing of the guards and Jack the Ripper and a lot of the things other tour guides were all talking about, just too much. They were interesting tours, but they've been really well covered. And then some ideas, I think like the formality of those tours meant that they almost had more of a life than the actual guides that were putting them out there. So we wanted to put tours together that were actually put together by the guides, that they'd researched, things that they were interested in. So that's what I do now, and do that and teach in college as well. But it's a really interesting chance to meet people and find out about people who from the past. So if you just move on the slide. Well, this is a really famous painting, The Fighting Temeraire, one of Turner's paintings. And I was talking about this painting on the spot where it was painted, down on the banks of the River Thames near Rotherhithe, not so very far from where we are now, a few streets away you go down there. And in Turner's painting, he was seeing the final journey of the ship, the Temeraire, which is being taken up to be scrapped after its long naval history. The way Turner's painted it is a sort of almost ambiguity about it. Is the ship actually really there, or is it a ghostly memory of the past? So it was one of these things that existed in the material world, with the big ship being towed down the river, but it was also a memory. And I was telling everyone about it and saying, isn't it an outrage? After years of service, this ship had fought the Battle of Trafalgar and rescued Nelson's ship, the Victory, and while the Victory's looked after in Portsmouth Harbour, the Temeraire was scrapped and thrown away like a piece of rubbish. I was getting so animated about it. One of the people said, well, were you actually a crew member of the ship? And I realised, I thought to myself, yeah, I am getting quite angry about something that had happened a long time ago and I had no influence over whatsoever. So it just made me think, I do get into this world being a tour guide. So that's really another thing I wanted to talk about. So, the thing I was talking to Serafina about was Mrs. Dalloway. So it's a book which is written by Virginia Woolf, and it's a book which follows the thoughts of various Londoners on one particular day, and their lives intermesh and intertwine. And there's a quote from it I want to read to you. It takes place in Green Park in London. It's a park where, during the 1920s, when the book had been written, a lot of the houses that lived around the park had all been demolished and were now just memories. And Mrs. Dalloway is walking through the park, and her memories are taken back to that time. Devonshire House, Bath House, the house with the china cockatoo. She'd seen them all lit up once and remembered Sylvia, Fred, Sally Seaton, such hosts of people, and dancing and all night, and the wagons plodding past to market and driving home across the park. She remembered once throwing a shilling into the Serpentine. Everyone remembered. What she loved was this, here, now in front of her, the fat lady in the cab. Did it matter then when she asked herself, walking towards Bond Street, did it matter that she must inevitably cease completely? All this must go on without her. Did she resent it? Or did it not become consoling to believe that death ended absolutely, but that somehow in the streets of London, on the ebb and flow of things, here, there, she survived, Peter survived, lived in each other. She being part, she was positive of the trees at home, of the house there, ugly, rambling, all to bits and pieces, as it was, part of people she'd never met, being laid out like a mist between the people she knew best, who lifted her on their branches as she'd seen the trees lift the mist, but it spread ever so far, her life, herself. I really love that idea of people being a mist in between, as people we've never met, people we've overlapped with in time being this mist. We're all Londoners who've lived it our little time in London, but we rely on things that have happened in the past and will pass on things to people in the future. All our time in this city just contributes to this overall idea of London. And the idea of a mist between us, like we can still have our presence of the people in the past and the people in the future will sense us here. It was a really powerful idea to me. And that's what I'm going to talk about to you for the rest of the talk, is just this idea of some of the people who seem real to me. So if we go on to the next one. Well, this is a sad story based around the statue of Queen Anne. You might have seen this outside St Paul's Cathedral. And this involves someone I don't even know the name of, will never know the name of, but he was described as a Lascar. So a Lascar was a very generic term given to any Asian sailor who'd come to London with the East India Company. So the East India Company were traders, very ruthless traders, who traded and eventually ended up ruling over India from the 1600s up until the mid-1800s. Their journeys were very, very dangerous journeys, and it was not uncommon for the crews from London, for some of them to die on the way out to Malaysia, to India, to Japan, to China, all those places. So on the way back, they would pick up what they called Lascars. These were sailors who experienced sailors from Asia and then bring them back to London. Now, the East India Company, very heartless employees, they didn't really care what happened to the Lascars when they got to London. For the most part, they would give them some accommodation in a place called the Orchard House in East London, and they would just say, well, you're meant to stay here and hopefully you'll find another journey back. But one Lascar decided he didn't want to do that, and he comes out for a night out in London, ends up getting incredibly drunk, and in a fit of anger or madness, we don't really know, he attacks the statue of Queen Anne outside St Paul's Cathedral, has a huge knife, and he lops off her two hands. And I thought it was really symbolic, because the hands were at the time like holding a globe, and the idea that the Queen Anne was like mistress of the whole globe, and here was an Asian sailor sort of taking away the globe from her. Well, no one really wants to take on a man with two knives in the middle of the street, so it takes a long time for him to be arrested, but then he spends the rest of his life in the Bedlam mental hospital in London. And this is a really strange life this person has had. This was in the early 1700s, and he's come from Asia and then ended up in a mental hospital in London. So whenever I pass this statue, I think of him. You might be saying, hang on, I can see she's still got her hands here. Well, the statue's in such poor shape after that, it had to be replaced in the middle of the 1800s. So the one you see outside St Paul's is a replacement of the original statue. But I always think of him, I'll never know his name, but I always think of him when I see the statue. Right, let's carry on. Well, this is another just random thing that I came across. This is a gravestone in a churchyard very near St Paul's Station. So if you come out of St Paul's Station, across the street is the ruined churchyard of I was walking through the churchyard, and they've got a really lovely garden there, and enjoying the scent of the garden. As I walked, I looked down and realised I was walking on some gravestones, and could just see the name, the great Mary Seeley, and of William Seeley. I thought, what are the chances are I could find out anything about these people? And as I looked into some old newspapers from around the time of their death in 1829, it turned out to be a very, very sad story. So Mary and William had run the pub in Marlborough Street in London. This is just off the main streets in Soho, just round the corner from the shop Liberties. You'll find the pub called the Shakespeare's Head, one of the most well-known pubs in the West End. And it turned out a pair of them had run the Shakespeare's Head. Well, Mary had died in 1828. I was never able to find out what she died of, but apparently William then went into a really sad state of affairs where he just stopped running the pub well. The pub started to go into a decline, and one day he just came down, no one came down and opened the pub up, and his son opened up the doors, and it was really quiet. So he headed up the stairs. When he went to his father's bedroom, the door was firmly shut. Opened the door and found William Seeley hanging there. He'd never been able to get over the depression of his father's, his wife's death. And so this grim find for the son, finding his father hanging there. His son then takes over running the pub and runs it for 23 years. But how strange that must have been for him, running the pub and knowing it is where his father had committed suicide all those years before. So not a huge story in London terms, but again, whenever I pass the pub now, I always have a drink for William Seeley and try and remember him there. Just another of those stories that you just come across on the streets of London. We'll carry on there. That's the next one. Well, this is a story about a woman here. She's called Gigiola della Savina. She's part of the area that was known as Little Italy in Clerkenwell during the 1930s. There'd been an Italian community grown up since the 1830s in that part of Clerkenwell. So there'd been terrible, terrible poverty in northern Italy in the early 1800s, and a lot of people were forced to try and look to start a new life. They decided to come and go to this city they've heard about on the other side of Europe, London, where there's supposedly lots of opportunities. These people are too poor to afford a boat ticket, so they often end up walking all the way across Europe. They might take them years of journeys to get here, so they might have to work some of the way, then carry on working, and eventually get here. Even when you got to Dover, it's still a long journey to get to London, so people might often have to pick hops for a season before they can even get to London. Well, that community grows up, and by the 1900s, they start to get quite settled. And this is when Gigiola moves to London. So in 1904, she comes to London. She then was a 14-year-old girl. She'd been sent by her parents to try and work in a cafe in Soho, like a lot of Italian people at that time. And when she's on the ferry over to Dover, she's getting very seasick and very homesick. So she meets a boy on the ferry who comforts her, and then she comes to work and live in the Clerkenwell area and work in Soho. 4 years later, she meets him in Finsbury Park when they're out walking. They bump into each other again, they end up falling in love, end up getting married and having children, and Gigiola comes to live in the streets of Clerkenwell, this area around Little Italy. She's a really important woman in this community. She works in Ted's Cafe. So the cafe was just opposite where the Daily Mirror Printworks was. The Printworks building is still there. The cafe, I'm afraid, is long since gone. But often when I walk past the Printworks, I think of her running the cafe and all the thirsty printers coming out. But she was really important. This community, there were a lot of people who didn't speak English, but they still needed all the services you need in a community. So she becomes like the unofficial midwife and delivers babies in the middle of the night. When people are sick, she arranges health care for them, and when there are people die in the night, she lays out the body and arranges all the funeral arrangements. A really important woman. Well, in 1940, the Italian community faced this real problem that Italy has declared war on Britain. And Winston Churchill said that anyone of Italian heritage was potentially an enemy agent. It's really harsh on a lot of the Italian people there. Some of them have been in London for 5 generations. There have been people who've been fought in the British Army in World War I, and then they were treated as enemy agents. And that's what happens to poor Gigiola's 2 sons. They're arrested one morning by the police and taken away on a boat to the Isle of Man to be put in an internment camp. And poor Gigiola never gets to see her sons again. So the war carries on. At the end of the war, the Germans start firing these new rocket weapons, the V1 and the V2, and they're very destructive weapons, but you don't get any warning they're coming, unlike the air raids before you'd hear the aircraft coming. One morning, Gigiola's gone to market, and there's a huge explosion over in Smithfield Market. People come out to the streets of Little Italy, and they go, "Oh my God, Gigiola, she's gone to the market today." Well, they wait a little while, and then they see Gigiola walking down the street, blood coming out of her head. And they say to her, "What on earth are you doing here? Why didn't you go to hospital?" And Gigiola says, "There was a pregnant woman who was in the rubble. I helped dig her out. She needed to be in the ambulance more than me, so I let her go. And then I came back to my home." Well, sadly, 2 days later, Gigiola dies from the head injury. And I always think about her when I'm passing the site. There are so many heroes in World War II, but they weren't all on the front line. A lot of the heroes were ordinary people who were out in the streets of London, people like Gigiola. Okay, our next picture. Well, I've got another thing to read from you. So this is a book, very famous book, Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year. So this was a book written about the Great Plague in 1665. It wasn't actually written until about 50 years later. Daniel Dafoe did an amazing job of writing this book, which reads like it's an eyewitness account of the Great Plague. He was only a boy when it was written, but he thought that it would be interesting to try and get together a book that sounded like eyewitness accounts. It was meant in some ways as a warning to what would happen if plague ever happened to London again. There was a fear in the 1720s that there was another plague coming. So it's got some really powerful writing in it. I'm going to read you a little bit about the person who's narrating the book, who's we only know as HF, has seen a funeral procession coming at a street called the Minories, which is very close to here, just outside Aldgate tube station. If you walk a little bit further down the street, there's a street called Minories, and the scene takes place there. I was just talking to the man by the graveyard, and I stood wavering for a good while, but just at the interval, I saw 2 links come over the end of the Minories. So a link is someone who's got a flaming torch lighting the street so that you can see what's coming. And I heard the bellman, and then appeared a dead cart coming over the streets, so I could no longer resist my desire of seeing it, and went in. There was nobody, as I could perceive at first, in the churchyard or going into it, but the buriers and the fellow that drove the cart. But when they came up to the pit, they saw a man go to and again, muffled up in a cloak, as if he was in great agony, and the buriers immediately gathered about him, supposing he was one of those poor, delirious or desperate creatures that used to pretend to bury themselves. He said nothing as he walked about, but 2 or 3 times groaned very deeply and loud, and sighed as he would break his heart. When the buriers came up to him, they soon found he was neither a person infected and desperate or a person distempered. Distempered in this means that they've got the plague. Distempered in mind, but one oppressed with a dreadful weight of grief indeed, having his wife and several of his children all in the car that was just come in with him. And he followed in an agony and an excess of sorrow. He mourned heartily, as it was easy to see, with a kind of masculine grief that could not give itself vent by tears, and calmly defying the barriers to let him alone, said he would only see the body thrown in and go away. So they left, importuning him, but no sooner was the cart turned round and the body shot into the pit, which was a surprise to him, for he at least expected they would have been decently laid in. Though no sooner did he see the sight, he cried out aloud, unable to contain himself. I could not hear what he said, but he went backwards 2 or 3 steps and fell down in a swoon. The barriers ran to him and took him up, and in a little while he came to himself, and they led him away to the Pie Tavern over against the end of Houndsditch, where, it seems, the man was known, and where they took care of him. He looked into the pit again as he went away, but the barriers had covered the body so immediately with throwing in earth that though there was light enough for there were lanterns and candles in them, placed at night around the sides of the pit, on heaps of earth, 7 or 8, or perhaps more, yet nothing could be seen. So it's a very, very powerful piece of writing, the idea of someone who's seen all of their family die from this plague, which no one knows the answer to, and they haven't really even had a chance to come to terms with their grief, and yet there's no chance of proper burial, and so he sees his whole family's bodies dumped into a pit. It was a very, very shocking piece of writing, and I felt a lot of resonance with that when I saw the scenes we had in the last couple of years of COVID, of people experiencing grief there. And I really found that the book meant even more to me after seeing that. It's very, very easy, after a long period of time, for events to be treated without any kind of reverence. So we often see that as tour guides when people are talking about the Great Plague, and they almost make it a comedy idea or a pantomime. Or similarly, the way the Jack the Ripper story has been told in a lot of tour guides, they'll treat it as if it's a comedy story or a pantomime story. But at the end of the day, these are real moments of grief about real people. And I think Daniel Defoe's writing there allows us, as people in 2022, to connect with people in 1665 and experience the same emotions as them. And that's part of that same idea of this mist that runs through the city, that we can connect with these people ever so far away in time, but still connected to us emotionally. So, great book. It's well worth a read, just in light of current events. When I first read it 10 years ago, I sort of chortled and went, oh, they really handled things badly in 1665. But you read it again now, we did exactly the same things now. So you can read all about the quack cures that people come up for the plague, and the ridiculous ideas that people have theories about how it was started and how they spread around, how there's paranoia in the city and fear of strangers. It really struck home, so a great book to read. Okay, carry on. Well, this is someone going back a long way in London's history, probably the first Londoner we know the name of. Actually, this isn't the statue of the person I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of the gravestone over here. A little bit confusing. So, if you go to Tower Hill Station, look out for the statue over here. This is a statue of Emperor Trajan, who was Roman emperor in the early 100s. Trajan's statue doesn't really belong in London at all, because Trajan never came to London. They actually found this statue in a junkyard in Southampton in the 1920s and decided, it looked quite good next to the bit of Roman wall that's next to the tube station at Tower Hill. But the Roman wall, it was built in the 190s, and in the Roman wall they found a tombstone. So the tombstone had been used by the Romans as a sort of hasty way to build the wall. And it was a tombstone which had been from 130 years before. So if you go next to the statue, you can find a copy of the tombstone here. So this is a tombstone of Gaius Classicanus Alpini, it's the other way around, Gaius Alpini Classicanus, the Roman procurator in London in 61 AD. So he's probably the first Londoner we know the name of. And so London's founded around 43 AD. And it's quite a thriving trading city. There's a bridge across the River Thames. And if you have a bridge, well, you need some soldiers to guard the bridge. And if you've got soldiers, well, they'll need supplies bringing in. And if you've got supplies, you need a person to be in charge of the supplies. So you build a warehouse and you build a house for the merchants. And merchants don't want to live a poor life. They want all the things they had in Rome. But the trouble when you're sent to Britain is, well, these Britons are not very civilized. They don't like wine like we do. So you're going to have to import wine. They don't like olives like the Romans do, so you're going to have to import olives. And they don't like the fermented fish sauce that Romans put on all their food. Yeah, for good reason we don't like it, but they're going to have to import that as well. So it's not long before they're importing lots of stuff, and London becomes this thriving city, Londinium, by 61 AD. Now, the Romans had not been very good to the Britons who they had moved into their country. And out in East Anglia, the Romans had come to this power-sharing deal with the Iceni people, the people who live out in East Anglia. And half the land belonged to the Romans, half belonged to the Iceni chief Pratigustus. When Pratigustus dies, he wants to leave it all to his wife Boudica, and the Romans say a woman cannot inherit the land. Boudica protests, and the Romans, to put her in her place, they capture her, tie her up, and then whip her in front of her population, and then they rape her two daughters in front of them. So Boudica, to get revenge, launches this revolt. They come to the Roman capital, Camalodunum, which at that time, the city of Colchester, burn it to the ground and kill every Roman there. And then they come towards London, and the military commander of London says, we cannot defend this city. You better leave the city if you want to survive. So everyone who can leaves, but some people stay behind. And then Boudica and our army burn the whole of London down. Well, after this event, they need someone else to come in and rebuild the city. And Classicanus is the person to do that. So he comes from Rome and takes over the job. But Boudica is killed in a battle against the Romans, and then the Romans start revenge against the Britons who revolted. So whole towns are being burned to the ground. Villages are having all their crops burned. They poison the Britons' land to make sure they can't grow any food. Classicanus sees this is going on, and he knows that the Britons will then want revenge for this act. You'll just have a cycle of revenge which goes on and on and on. And Classicanus decides that he's going to write to the Emperor Nero to get the Roman military commander replaced with someone who's prepared to make peace. So that happens, a new military commander comes in and peace is declared. They've decided to call it a peace treaty between the two sides. And then finally they can get on with the job of rebuilding London. So we know with Classicanus that he spent 6 years rebuilding London from this burnt down city. So he's a person of peace and he's a person of rebuilding. I think he's probably our first London hero that we know anything about. So when he dies, this tombstone is put in place and it's paid for by his wife. We've got the name of her over here. She's called Julia Placata. So just see her name on the tombstone. So she's the first woman we know the name of in London. And I like the fact that we've got these two people's names. You can actually find letters written by them and accounts by them in the works of the writer Tacitus. So it's the first Londoner that's written about. Anyway, the tombstone, the original tombstone is... this is another person I really like the story of. Someone I came across in records from the Old Bailey prison. The Old Bailey Court. And this is a picture of Newgate Prison. So Newgate was one of these fearsome prisons in London that had been around since medieval times and still around in the 1800s. A place where people could be thrown into and forgotten. And a place a lot of cruelty went on in there. Also, a place where prisoners, if they had a bit of money, could bribe the guards to allow them to have drinks. So they were often places like lots of drunkenness and cruelty from prisoner to prisoner. It's a real hellhole of a prison. And it's in Newgate Prison that a woman called Elizabeth Longman is being held in 1680. She is a career criminal and has spent all of her life ending up in different prisons in London. Eventually, with her sentence, having been in Newgate Prison, they say, right, I've had enough of you now. We're going to give you a new sentence, being deported to Virginia, this new colony that Britain has set up in North America. Virginia is desperate for people to help them grow tobacco. And so prisoners were sent over from London and then forced to work for a short while. And then usually after they'd finished their sentence, they'd start off a new life as a farmer in Virginia and then start a new life. Elizabeth doesn't want to do that though. So when she's sent to Virginia, she bribes one of the people who owns a farm there to allow her to get back on the ship and heads back to London. I just can't understand, some people just love London so much, or just have the appeal of London is so strong that even if you've got a chance to start a new life, she didn't want to do that. So she heads back to London and then is arrested more or less straight away for burglary. So she ends up in prison, and some of her friends who live on a street called Saffron Hill, which is still there today in Clerkenwell, you can find it today, they come and visit her in prison, and they talk about a man on Saffron Hill who has an amazing set of silver in his house. And Elizabeth says to him, call yourself men. If you were real men, you'd have stolen that silver by now. I want you to go back, steal all the silver, and I want half the profits from doing it, for coming up with the idea. So they go about stealing the silver, but they don't do a very good job of it. They're all arrested, and when it comes up for trial, they say it was Elizabeth Longman's idea, it was all her fault. So she's then put on trial, and they say, well, we've given you every sentence we can think of. You've been in every prison. We gave you a chance to go to Virginia. You're now going to face the death penalty. Well, she says to them, you can't hang me because I am pregnant. And they say, oh, really? Okay. So they wait 10 months with her in prison, and nothing very much has happened. So they decide that they're going to execute her after all. She's taken across London to Tyburn, the places where executions are carried out. And there, the noose is put around her neck, and prisoners are given a chance to speak to the priest to absolve themselves of any last crime. When the priest comes to her, she just spits in his face and swears at him. And she then put the noose around her, and they cut away the support. She's hanging there, and she swears at all this crowd with her last breath. So someone who's just completely defiant and completely committed to like the criminal cause, but someone who's still addicted to the idea of London. And I think that's one of the things I think of when London's a city of ideas. Not all the ideas are conventional ideas or necessarily good ideas, but it's a city of ideas. And I like to think of her every time I pass in Tyburn. Okay, yeah, carry on. Oh, here's another story. Oh, there's a crash there. Another story going back quite a long way. This is it's one of the earliest pictures we have of the Tower of London. So you can see the white tower of the Tower of London over here. And this is old London Bridge, with houses going across it over here. So this picture is probably from about 1400, not long after the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. So the Peasants' Revolt It's caused by a new tax that's brought in called the poll tax. It means the rich and the poor have to pay exactly the same amount. Massive tax cut for the rich, massive tax hike for the poor. And when they're trying to enforce the tax in the areas of Essex and Kent, the rural areas there, a lot of the people there are not happy about this. And they march to London and surround London. Now, there are various different groups of rebels, but one of them camps outside the Tower of London, where the two tax makers, a man called Robert Hale and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon of Sudbury, they were in charge of taxes. They're terrified by this group of rebels that's come to London, so they hide inside the Tower of London. Well, one of the groups of rebels is led by a woman called Joanna Farrar. Joanna Farrar organises her mob together and says, why should we pay these taxes? We are just ordinary peasants. We come to give out more and more of our money to give people who live in comparative wealth in London this break in life. Why should we have to do this? This is our chance to try and strike out for them. Are you following me into the Tower of London to get these two tax makers? So she leads this mob into London, to the Tower of London, grabs hold of them, they take them outside onto this Tower Hill, the spot outside the station there, and then cut off the heads of the two tax makers. That's a really drastic measure, I must admit. Watch out, anyone who sets taxes in Britain today, there is a bit of a precedent. So, Joanna Farrar's name, though, has disappeared from history for a long time. The stories that are written about the Peasants' Revolt all talk about the male leaders, like people like John Ball, the preacher, who'd preached for this idea of equality. But Joanna Farrar's name had been forgotten. She's sort of been rediscovered in the last 15 years by people who are going through medieval court records. Amazingly, they didn't execute her. No one's ever understood why. I really like the idea that she was a woman who took action and was able to organise to defend her community, even if it was in a very, very violent way. What happened? Well, we don't really know. We know she wasn't executed because she gets charged with a crime later on, about 10 years on. So there's a court record of her there. So we don't know if she was then maybe put in prison after that, or she'd been spent some time. A lot of the people in the Peasants' Revolt who were leaders ended up being executed. But she obviously hadn't been executed straight away because she's mentioned 10 years later on. So an interesting figure in history, one of these many, many people who just exist in this mist in between us and them. Well, one person who I'm often thinking about when I'm walking around London is my father. So he was in the Merchant Navy and spent a lot of time travelling to London in the 1950s and 1960s. And when I was growing up, I would often see, like, my mum would show an atlas and say, oh, this is where your dad is at the moment, sometimes around in the world. And I heard my dad's stories about the London docks when I was growing up. I came to London after going to university and came to London in 1990 and then started to explore this past world of the docks. And it really fascinated me because by this stage, London's docks had closed down and become derelict spaces, huge empty spaces, but derelict nonetheless. So I started to experience the docks, and the more I just talked to my dad about it, the more I realised our worlds were overlapping. He came with me on a few journeys. He found it a bit hard to get around sometimes. He said, oh, we just want to go down this street over here. And I said, Dad, that street doesn't exist anymore. It's now been built on. So we have these two worlds. So this is the same area of the Royal Victoria Docks. This is it today where there are modern houses. They've still kept the cranes over here. And these are the same cranes over here in the era my dad would have known. So it's the same space, just in a different time and experienced by different people. One of the things that really drove me being a tour guide is this idea of things that you can no longer see and how they used to be and trying to conjure them up. In 1990, I was walking along the river with my friend Steve, who we often explore London with, and an old man came and talked to us while we were sat on the bench, and he was telling us about what the river was like in those days, and talked about all the ships in the river on New Year's Eve and how they would light up all the lights on the ships and they would all sound their sirens at midnight. It was such an evocative image. I've never really forgotten that man's description of it. So if I can try and describe things to other people and make them as excited about it, well, I've done a really good job. So I love the idea that I'm experiencing the same place as my father. I once said to him, "Oh, you should go to this great pub I know, the Prospect of Whitby down by the riverside." And he went, "Oh, I used to go there all the time in the 1960s. That was my pub. You haven't discovered anything. That was going back for years." So I really like that idea as well. Okay, I think the final slide. Well, I hope you enjoyed hearing these stories of Londoners past who I like talking about. As I say, these people often seem so real to me. I forget that they're not around. So if you want to find out more, our website's footprintsoflondon.com. And we've got 30 guides who are all interested in their own particular thing. So what I also like is the fact that I'll walk along the street and talk about the thing that interests me. And one of the other guides will say, no, what's really interesting in the street is this, and you'll get a completely different story. So thanks so much for asking me to talk. And if you've got questions, please feel free to ask.
Thank you so much.
Yes, I do have a question. So you talked of what mist means to you, and I was wondering if you can actually explain a little bit more about it. Does mist mean time for you, or is it more landscape? Is it more like ghosts? Or?
Ghost is a close word to what I'm thinking of. It's presence, really, what I'm thinking of. So I think of like spaces as being in like a fourth dimension of time, and like the mist is like the sense you can get of someone else has been on that street maybe 100 years, 200 years, but we're sharing exactly the same spot. Like I'm standing outside the house where I know another person has lived. There's a really great house down near Victoria, and there's a plaque on the wall which said, "Noel Coward lives here." And I love just standing on the same spot and thinking I'm standing on the same spot as Noel Coward, and he'd been walking this way, and the only thing that's the barrier is between us is that was 70 years ago. And time just seems like such a weak thing when you're in my experience of London, like that separates us. It's when we share a space, time's not so important. That's kind of what I mean anyway.
That's an Wow, that's great.
You know how you were talking about how London is kind of the city that you explore, you visit. Why London as opposed to other cities?
Oh, for sure, yeah. I mean, I'm not saying London has any particular magical properties over other cities. I think there is a certain amount of critical mass in London, though, because it's a city that's been lived in by so many different people. And so many people have come here as an opportunity to express their ideas. So I think this kind of magical, unmaterial quality of the city is intensely strong in London, because there have been so many people that this is their chance to express their ideas. People come to London to meet other people. When all those ideas get together, something special is generated. I'm not trying to claim London is any better than Paris or Madrid or anything. It's just a city I know and understand, I've known for a very long time. But I think it's something that you get in London more than maybe a small town, where maybe the people who've lived here have all lived a very similar kind of life. London, you get all these strands of people, and I could go out the street now and walk down the street and probably get 100 different ways people see London, because they're all living a different kind of life in the same space.
Oh, so, Reg, coming from what you just said, I'm just wondering, so you said that you feel the presence of people who used to stand where you are and everything, and so then, do you ever get lonely in London? You don't feel the presence all the time.
Yeah, no, not really. No, I've never suffered from loneliness. I don't know. It's sort of, I think just the fact that there's, in some ways, you almost feel overcrowded is the problem with London. There's just too many ideas, and sometimes you think you know a place, and then you discover you hardly know anything about it because there's another story opens up on the street. And so, yeah, there's always something there. In my opinion, anyway. Yeah, I think I've always found like London a really comforting place from that point of view.
So you've never found it overwhelming without everyone?
Never really, but occasionally there are times when I think I just need to go somewhere else for a little while because there's just so much intensity on the streets of London. This is, I'm not saying it's the same thing at all, but this is something that Virginia Woolf felt. There are some of her descriptions of London you can read, and it's so detailed. She's like talks about the sound of a bird, the sound of a car engine, the sound of the railings, the sight of a tree. You're thinking if you're getting that experience from walking down the street, you'll never be able to get anywhere because it's so intense. And she found London very overwhelming and had to spend periods of her life when she was out of London. And there are times when I think I need to go somewhere which becomes completely separate from the history, and I can experience it more at the time. So I do occasionally get that feeling.
Is there a specific path that you like to take walks on?
Well, I love the River Thames. So I'll often return to the River Thames time and time again, and always enjoy just the light and the sound of the river and just the space. So yeah, I never get tired of the River Thames. But there's always like a new bit of London to discover, and every time you find something exciting and new, that's always quite a buzz as well.
As you've done throughout, I don't know how many years, has any path changed and places you used to like before has now changed and become different?
Yeah, I mean that is one of the problems in London, is the constant changing. And when you're an older guy, you're always saying, "Oh, things were much better in the old days." You're always doing that. The Docklands area has changed so much since I first came here. So it was an area of derelict empty spaces in the 1990s, which were great places to explore, and a lot of them have now been built over with new housing, which is needed, but it wasn't what I wanted. So sometimes it can be a little bit frustrating. So yeah, like places like the Lee Mouth Peninsula, it's a little bit of land in between the River Thames and the River Lee. I used to love going back there in the 1990s because it was like a time capsule. It was a bit of land that developers hadn't discovered, and it looked like it did in the 1950s, so it was like going back to a different time. But they found it now, so they built some big skyscrapers on it, and it's never going to be the same. But it's, as I say, it's about the imagination rather than what's physically there. It's connecting with what has been there in the past. So I'll never lose the feeling.
So then you said that it's all about imagination and perhaps seeing back in time and seeing what it could be in the future. What do you think about what is it called? Augmented reality devices, virtual reality?
Oh yeah, I mean it's.
So that people often nowadays have like programs on their
there's been some really interesting.
I'm not a tech person, so.
Yeah, me neither, unfortunately. But there's been some really interesting things done in that way. The Museum of London had an app on your phone that you could get for a while, where you could stand on selected street corners and then swipe and see what it looked like. And I really like that idea. So yeah, that'd be a real exciting thing to do in the future. Because you can't wander around London with a virtual reality. Health and safety reasons, I wouldn't recommend doing that. But yeah, it's got a lot of potential for it there. It's interesting, that's becoming more and more accessible. So if you had for any of you fans of Google Street View, there's an option now to go back in time to see what it looked like in 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and if they've got old photographs of the area, you can see it there. And so yeah, a lot of potential for that.
Oh, wow.
Oh, right, I'm just conscious of time.
For sure, yeah.
I have 10 minutes.
Where? We do?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Do you want something to drink? Or?
I'm cool, thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
And this is just out of curiosity. So, the unofficial midwife who had funeral arrangements in Little Italy, and you told us that she got head injury by trying to save this pregnant woman, and then she died 2 days after. Did she know the pregnant lady? Did she know?
I think, I don't know actually. Yeah, that's an interesting thing. The story's in a really great collection of oral history that my in-laws lived next door to this lovely old lady called Doris who collected stories from the Italian community. So she knew that those people were all dying and the stories could disappear unless they were all written down. So she wrote this really great book about them. Now she sadly died as well, so I like to try and keep the stories alive by telling them. But I don't know if the pregnant lady knew if someone had saved her life or not. I mean, it's possible she might have known but not known who it was. It's when you're in the middle of a disaster, you don't always ask names and addresses, do you?
So in your book, there's quite a bit of research that you're doing. Where do you usually go to do research?
Well, I like reading old newspapers, so that's a good way of doing it. There's British Library's newspaper collection you can get online. So it's really great. You can sit down on the live sofa at night and then flick through the newspapers from 1723. It's easy to get absorbed in those sort of things. And there are things like records of court cases from the Old Bailey, which are really descriptive. And then there's also lots of lovely old diaries of people in London. So it's I think that's another thing which makes it a good city to do this in, because it's very well documented and the records are quite easy to get hold of, whereas in some cities it might be harder to access these things. So that might be another reason why London.
Yeah.
Do you keep any written record?
Yeah, no, really. I know. It's, the only thing I really have is sort of my personal Facebook thing, and I always try and keep it sort of like fresh with what I've been doing each day. And often it's not so much for all my friends to see; it's just so I can go back and try and remember myself. So yeah, it'd be good to have kept a diary all that time, but not something I've never really done myself.
I was just wondering, when you got feeling that you're looking back and going back, and you said earlier how sometimes, when you pass through these places, you think of them. Do you ever find yourself living in your past rather than the present?
Well, yeah, I think when the people were talking about when I was getting angry about the wrecking of the Temeraire, they did say, you are taking this a little bit too seriously, perhaps. And there are times I do think to myself, you're still angry about the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. Like, just let it go. And perhaps I do take it a little bit too seriously. I don't know. It's interesting because it's nothing I can have any influence on, but I still like to think about. So yeah, maybe I do live in the past too much.
I don't think it's a bad thing though.
I think I definitely do that, actually.
I think it's always good to think about how things might have been. If we don't think about how things might have been, you'll never think about how they could be. And we don't want to just accept like today is what we're given and we haven't got any choice over it.
Yeah.
There's also something that you can only, smile at because it happened in the past, and, you think about current situation and, it's not too bad if you think about past,
Yeah, true. That's true as well. Gives you a sense of perspective on today.
Yeah, totally.
For sure.
Do you ever feel like disconnected from what you read or what you research? Because like the London we live in now is very different from like 200 years ago. So that's something like it's happened, you've read that it's happened, but sometimes like you can't help but think that this doesn't seem right, you know?
For sure. I mean, there are a lot of accounts, particularly in the 1700s. London is a brutal, hard city to live in, and there's some real cruelty and real just callous disregard for other people. I'm thinking of pregnant women who forced to have their children their children just left abandoned on the streets and things like that. And it's sometimes you feel like it's really hard to get into that mindset. But I just like the fact that we're all human. We're not like different species to the people of the 1700s. Everyone, it may have been a different world, but people still reacted the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. I was wondering, because you've been talking about many characters, and is there one particular character you kind of feel special, feeling? Personally, maybe no one find that person is very important, but you find you feel kind of personal connection with?
Oh, well, I don't know if I can find a personal connection with her, but I do like Elizabeth Longman, the sort of career criminal who just never gave up.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say I identified with her, but I do kind of admire her in a sort of perverse way. The fact that she's just so determined to commit crime.
Yeah, and I actually have a question about her. So what was her usual crime? Was it theft? Or...
Yeah, mainly, so mainly burglary she'd carried out, yeah.
Do we know why she got into it?
We don't know anything much about her, I'm afraid. It's just all we know are her offences. It's one of these people that, a lot of Londoners, they only appear once they come into officialdom. Ordinary, a lot of ordinary Londoners' lives, they're just really undocumented. My friend Laura, she's obsessed with medieval women, and she's facing this fact in research. Just no one's bothered to write about them. They're not seen as important enough to write about. So she's had to sort of come up with characters that she's created who would have lived those lives just based on what we know about those kind of jobs. And so I really like the way she thinks as well as trying to sort of put stories together from what might have been. My characters are all the ones who appear in newspapers and appear in court records, so perhaps they're not ordinary people because things happen to them, and most people's lives we don't get in the court papers and we don't get in the newspapers. So yeah, it's a bit strange in that way.
Another question.
Oh, sure.
But like you were saying, you only read about people who appear in newspaper or is that not as in you don't get to enjoy those stories about London?
Yeah.
How does that make you feel to live in the city as well?
Yeah. I think that is a troubling fact, because you think it's dangerous to think the news is real sometimes, isn't it? I mean, we've got to remember there's all kinds of bits of the world where nothing terribly bad has happened for a long time. We should really focus on that, and I suppose I'm just focusing on unusual incidents. So yeah, it is a bit of an awkward feeling. I picked out stories today which has sort of got a connection with death and loss to sort of fit in with your theme today. But some of my stories are a bit more joyful than that. So just like that.
I was wondering, so in your research you say that you told us that a lot of it was through oral history. So then how do you differentiate between oral history and gossip? Is there a way to differentiate them?
Yeah, not easy to do, is it? We live in such a documented age where there are multiple versions of so many stories, and we're expecting to be able to prove things definitively one way or another. And it's so hard to do with previous ages where all we have is just a fragment of a story, especially stories going back to the Roman times. There's only one account of this person's life written 120 years later. How are we meant to we can't make some sort of forensic proof of one person doing one thing or another. So it is very, very tricky because of that. And so yeah, I wouldn't say this is definitely proof this has happened. We just can't really do that.
What is your definition of oral history and gossip?
Oh, I see. All right.
No. I did ask what you were trying to answer.
Yeah.
But on top of that, I'm just...
Yeah, well, I hope oral history would be someone maybe being a bit more reflective and thinking back what was important at that time, and I'm trying to impress upon you, like, and on the walk I'll be going to a village which has completely disappeared off the map. It was called Creekmouth, and it was a little village where about 150 people lived up until the 1950s, but it's now just become an industrial area, and there's very little left of Creekmouth apart from the old school building, which is now part of a building firm, and the old pub, which has now become a Romanian wedding venue, and there's a mural to commemorate what the village being there. That was made by some artists about 10 years ago. So it's a village that I feel quite sad about because it's no longer there. It's a bit of a sad story. The village was so badly affected by flooding in 1953 that the village became abandoned, and so it's no longer there anymore. And I like these kind of lost communities. So that's my walk on Saturday, and next thing I'm working on.
Sorry, could you repeat the name of the village?
It's called Creekmouth, and it's at the mouth of the River Roding, which is a village in East London. It's now in London Borough of Barking and Dagenham, and it just doesn't exist anymore.
It reminds me of Atlantis.
It's kind of like that name, isn't it?
Flooding and everything.
Yeah.
That's so true though.
Yeah.
Oh, then will we be able to find more information if we go on to...
Yeah, go onto my website, footprintsoflondon.com,
Right.
and you find all the news. All my walks are on there, so have a look on there, and you'll find out all about what my colleagues are doing, and you'll see some really great walks, I hope. Yeah, come and join us. We also have virtual online talks and things like that, so if you don't want to go out walking, we can do that as well.
That's great.
Thank you.
Oh, well, thanks for inviting me. Thank you so much. Oh, you're too kind.